Thank you for your introduction, although I must confess that I didn't understand it. It's a pleasure to be here. I am sorry that I cannot talk to Italian, and I'm grateful for the translation. I shall present you with an overview of today's knowledge regarding the narcissistic personality disorder, its complications, and its treatment. The narcissistic personality disorder is a frequent, severe personality disorder. Approximately 30% of the most severe personality disorders, what we call borderline personality organization, that is, the very severe personality disorders, suffer from a narcissistic personality which can be treated nowadays with psychoanalytic psychotherapy, although the most severe cases cannot be helped, so that it is important to know the symptoms, the degrees of severity, and the prognostic indicators. The clinical manifestations of that personality disorder include pathology of the experience of the self, pathology of the experience of significant others, pathology of the internalized value systems, what in psychoanalytic language is called the superego, and pathology of a chronic affective or emotional experience in daily life. I will give you the main symptoms in each of these 4 segments. The pathology of the self-experience includes an extraordinary sense of self-importance, an exaggerated concentration on the self-importance, grandiosity, ambitiousness, an exaggerated sense of one's capabilities and possibilities in contrast to one's real capacities, a sense of being privileged, of having rights over those of others, a voracity of wanting to appropriate oneself of whatever one's desires, and an excessive, intensive, chronic experience of envy of other people, envy of what other people have, both consciously and unconsciously, and a superficiality of one's assessment of self and others in spite of what might be high intelligence in many cases. Regarding the relationships with significant other persons, they have a tendency for brief idealization of others whom they would like to imitate, or idealization of love objects with whom they would want to get involved, followed by rapid disappointment, disillusionment, a tendency to exploit others, a tendency to depreciatory, derogatory attitude toward others, difficulties in experiencing empathy with the experiences of others, a frequent tendency to become suspicious, paranoid with people who seem to criticize them or not to agree with them, and an inordinate need for admiration from others. So they are both derogatory, depreciative of others, and yet they need to be admired. This affects their love, all of this affects their love relations. They tend to have rapid falling in love periods followed by disenchantment, disillusionment, and so the relationships begin and end quickly, and they tend to develop a sexual promiscuity going from one person to another. Internalized value systems, what in psychoanalytic language is called their superego structure, they are fixated at childlike value systems rather than at the search for adult, mature value systems. They want to be admired because they are beautiful, they are wealthy, they have beautiful things that others don't have, they catch the attention for unusual things that they show and others don't, all of which conveys to them a childlike preoccupation with their appearance, their clothing, their possessions. They want to be admired because they have the latest model car, red shining cars, something unusual that will catch the attention of people, rather than being concerned about causing a good impression because of their emotional depth, their knowledge, their consideration of others, their empathy, their tactfulness. In short, there is something childlike, exhibitionistic about them, which is very easy to perceive even in brief contacts. The more severely ill narcissistic personalities, in addition, have difficulty in following a normal system of ethical values if they do not do antisocial things, if they do not steal, if they do not cheat. It's not because of guilt feelings, but because of shame. They follow a shame culture, not a guilt culture. They don't do bad things because they are afraid that they are going to be caught, not because of internal, well-established ethical morality. They have difficulty in establishing a realistic, self-critical attitude. When criticized, they either reject totally the criticism from others, or, if they can't escape it, become immediately depressed. So either they are non-critical at all, or totally depressed and experiencing themselves defeated. It's an all or nothing reaction. Regarding their emotional experience, finally, they suffer from a chronic sense of emptiness and boredom. They are chronically bored and need some artificial stimulation to maintain themselves excited and interested. They have a tendency to abuse drugs or alcohol, a tendency to look for exciting, even dangerous adventures. They show a degree of restlessness for stimulation in order to overcome that sense of emptiness. And their chronic sense of superiority and grandiosity tends to be disrupted from time to time when they experience failure or criticism that they cannot escape by a sense of total devastating inferiority. So they are either the greatest of the world or they are worth nothing in such breakthrough periods. They operate at a large spectrum of severity. They are narcissistic patients who function extremely well and others who function very poorly. So they can be classified according to degree of the severity of their social functioning. That is one way of classifying their severity. The other way of classifying their severity is in terms of the deterioration of their internalized value system, in other words, in terms of the degree of their moral consciousness, their internalized ethical value systems. The first classification is roughly in 3 degrees of severity. Those who function very well socially, they seem to be perfectly normal, except that they have a grandiose, exhibitionistic behavior. They have subtle difficulty in their social relation and at work because of their excessive competitiveness and envy, and they have difficulties in establishing emotional relation in depth, so that they have bad love relations. They may be married, but typically it's quite an empty, formalized, conventional marriage in which there are very few deep feelings. Those are the best functioning. At the second level of functioning, one has all the typical symptoms that I mentioned initially. Here, there are serious problems at work. Their difficulties at work interfere with their promotions. These are patients who are very good at doing what comes easy. If they have a talent, a capacity, they do great. But if they have to do any effort, if they have to study hard, if they have to work hard to learn something, they feel inside that is below them, and they drop what does not come easy. So they tend to function irregularly in school, in some subjects, great students, in others they fail. At work, whatever requires hard ongoing learning tends to be difficult or impossible, so their performance tends to be erratic, they don't get promoted, and in their love relations, the incapacity for a deeper emotional relation leads to a promiscuity that interferes with any stable relation, marriage, establishing a family, so they are rather lonely. That's the middle level who are sufficiently ill to look for treatment, while those at the best functioning level usually don't look for treatment, or if they look for treatment, it's only late in life when their youth, health, success, power disappears, and severe feeling of failure and inferiority bring about depression in later life. So that's when the best functioning come to treatment late. The second level come to treatment earlier in their life because they have difficulties in work, profession, love, intimacy, and social life. The most severely ill have a total breakdown in their capacity to work. They have fantasies, they want to be chiefs of industry, they want to be bosses on top. Practically, they can do nothing, are a complete social failure, and that may cause severe depressions. Very often one finds that even in spite of high intelligence and education, once they are at actual working, in a working situation, their functioning deteriorates, their failure degrades their possibility of getting employment, and finally they are totally unable to do anything. In their love relations, they have total incapacity for establishing any relationship. They may try to obtain sexual gratification with occasional encounters, but are incapable of any more lasting emotional relation, and of course never have experienced love relations or falling in love. And their social life is almost absent. So there is a total failure, and they may develop compensating symptoms, drug abuse and addiction, alcoholism, and these very often require hospitalization, and they tend to be confused with borderline personality disorders, another form of severe personality disorder that they mask at that point. From the viewpoint of their difficulty with their system, their weak system of internal morality, the classification from least to more severe indicates that many narcissistic personalities at all levels of severity that I described may maintain ordinary social criteria of morality. They do not steal, they do not falsify documents, they do not exploit others, they do not attack others, they do not destroy property, so that there is no antisocial behavior. This is prognostically good at all levels of severity of symptoms. On the other hand, there are other patients at any level who may show antisocial behavior. The more severe the antisocial behavior, the worse the prognosis. The mildest forms of antisocial behavior tend to be passive parasitic exploitation. Patients who exploit others financially, patients who may steal selectively from their family. One narcissistic art professor only stole art books in bookstores. Other than that, he was perfectly honest. So there are selected dishonesties, and the diagnosis then is narcissistic personality with antisocial features. At a more severe level, we find a combination of serious antisocial behavior, which is both passive parasitic, that is to say, exploitive, stealing, false documents, irresponsibility with money, exploitation of other, chronic lying, or aggressive, which means attacking people, destroying objects, up to antisocial attacks, robbery with causing physical harm, assault. So here there is serious antisocial behavior. But these patients still may have some areas of morality, a few friends whom they treat honestly, some people in whom they are honestly invested. There is a special syndrome in patients who have a severe degree of not functioning socially, as I mentioned before, a combination of aggressive behavior toward others as well as toward self, a tendency to attribute aggressive behavior toward others, in other words, paranoid trends, and antisocial behavior. This combination of poor functioning socially, in other words, very severe narcissistic personality, egocentric aggression toward others and self, paranoid traits, and antisocial behavior constitutes the syndrome of malignant narcissism. It is the most severe form of narcissistic personality that still can be treated with psychotherapy, with specialized psychotherapeutic treatment. The most severe type of narcissistic personalities show dominant antisocial behavior, either of the passive parasitic type that I mentioned, or of the aggressive type. These are patients where there is a total absence of any internalized ethical standards, a total absence of superego functioning, a total absence of a sense of morality, a total absence of any concern for self or others. These are patients who chronically lie, cheat, steal, exploit others, are totally irresponsible regarding money, or else destroy property, attack others, commit criminal acts, murder, serial murder, sexually dangerous perversions, without any sense of guilt or concern over their criminal behavior. They constitute what has been called the antisocial personality disorder. In older terminology, the psychopathic personality disorder or the psychopath. There are changing terminologies, but the general accepted terminologies nowadays is antisocial personality disorder, and one tends to call psychopath the most severe and dangerous of these patients. Their prognosis is zero. They do not respond to any treatment. The treatment consists in protecting family and society. They are in the realm of forensic psychiatry. The existence of these patients requires a careful differential diagnosis of any patient with antisocial behavior. We will summarize the differential diagnosis briefly. The differential diagnosis of antisocial behavior includes, first of all, the antisocial personality proper that I mentioned to you, that is a narcissistic personality with extremely severe passive parasitic or aggressive antisocial behavior without any capacity for guilt or concern for self or others, no capacity for remorse, no capacity to learn from experience, no capacity to foresee the long-term consequences of their behavior, no capacity for any non-exploitive investment in a relationship with somebody else. Prognosis zero, treatment, protection of family and society. The next less severe degree is the syndrome of malignant narcissism that I mentioned, that can be treated with the intensive psychotherapeutic treatment that we have developed as within the spectrum of transference-focused psychotherapies. The next less severe, still less severe of pathology is that of narcissistic personalities who show antisocial behavior but who do not fulfill the criteria for the syndrome of malignant narcissism, nor, of course, the antisocial personality proper. These are patients whose prognosis is more serious than that of narcissistic personalities without antisocial behavior, but they are eminently treatable. The next category, still less severe, are other severe personality disorders with antisocial behavior, but not narcissistic personalities with antisocial behavior. The next category, still better prognosis are personalities with a higher level functioning, what we call personality disorders at a neurotic level of pathology, who generally have a much better integration of their self, of what we call their identity, that is to say, an integrative view of themselves and of significant others. The next level, still milder, is that of adolescents with severe emotional crisis who carry out antisocial behavior as part of such emotional crisis, or because these adolescents have become part of a gang, of a social subgroup with antisocial behavior, which, if they were not part of, would end their social behavior. And finally, there are people who steal or rob because of hunger, extreme poverty, so there is antisocial behavior without pathology of the personality of one kind or another. So in all cases, we have to decide where does a patient with antisocial behavior stand. This will determine prognosis and treatment. We have discussed the clinical manifestations and the differential diagnosis of narcissistic pathology. I want to summarize the internal psychological structure of these patients. They have a different organization of their personality than what is true for normal persons and for personality disorders at a higher level or so-called neurotic level of personality organization, in contrast to borderline personality organization or severe personality disorders to which the narcissistic personality belongs. Normal personality and personality at a higher level or neurotic level of organization show what is called normal identity, which means a normal integration of the concept of the self, so that historically, throughout time, there is a continuity of the self-experience and a continuity of the self-experience throughout different kind of activities, interests, and involvements of the individual at any particular time. An integrated sense of self, in short. This integrated sense of self goes hand in hand with an integrated sense of the personality of significant other people. In other words, the person with a normal sense of self is also capable to integrate the various behaviors that the person comes to know in significant other persons into an integrated view of each of these persons. An integrated view of significant others complements the integrated view of self. Both together constitute normal identity. In contrast, patients with severe personality disorder or borderline personality organization have a lack of an integrated sense of self and a lack of an integrated sense of significant others. They have a division of representation of self that are very good, positive, rewarding, and other representations of self that are bad, unacceptable, painful, frightening, negative, and there is a complete split of such contradictory, idealized, and bad representations of self, and the same thing happens with their view of significant others that are divided into all good ones, idealized ones, and all bad ones, persecutory ones. So the world is divided into a segment of persecutory experiences of self and others, and idealized experiences of self and others, with a lack of integrated view, a lack of a realistically integrated view of self and others. That is called identity diffusion. That lack of an integrated sense of self and of significant others translates into a chaotic alternation of states of self, a chaotic alternation in one's relationships with significant others. It shows as discontinuity, chaos, generalized impulsivity, anxiety and confusion in one's relationships at work, in interpersonal relationships, in love, and is typical for all severe personality disorders. But in the case of the narcissistic personality disorder, a compensating structure has been developed, namely a pathological, grandiose self that protects against the underlying identity diffusion. The pathological, grandiose self is really a composite structure that includes realistic representation of the self and all the idealized representation of self and all the idealized representation of significant others. It is as if the individual had taken as being his essence all that is good, powerful, admirable in self and others, and devalued, depreciated, dismantled everything bad, unacceptable, inacceptable, problematic in self or others. So that this grandiose concept of the self is what translates in the symptoms of grandiosity and superiority and contempt that narcissistic patients show. Whatever is not great and becomes part of that pathological grandiose self is devalued or projected outside, so that their internal life is very empty. Their internal psychic experience is only of their own grandiosity, but they do not have an internal world of the representations of significant others that we normally have as part of our psychological experience. We normally keep in our mind in the representation of those whom we love, those who are our friends, those on whom we depend. And this internal world of representations of significant others permits us to have an internal sense of being accompanied, being in the middle of life, being in a rich world, not being alone, even when we are alone externally. Narcissistic personalities don't have that world. They have devalued that internal world, and therefore the chronic feeling of emptiness and the need for stimulation from the outside, and therefore the need for admiration from others. They need to be admired to confirm their grandiosity, because they don't have an internal world of friends and loved people whose representations surround the normal integrated self, abnormal personality structure. Usually we find in the history of narcissistic personalities severe frustrations, traumatizations, lack of authentic love received in the first years of their life, and typically a home atmosphere in which love was not available. But if they had qualities that could be admired by the parents, that was a source of admiration. The background of admiration because of their talents, because of their capacities, something special that they had, replaced the lack of love. So they became used to looking for admiration and to feel great as a consequence of admiration. So a vicious cycle between grandiosity and the need for confirming admiration developed. And at the same time, the same person had to struggle against intense resentment and hatred derived from these very early frustrations. Hatred of those who frustrated them, who were not available, would take particularly the form of envy. Envy is an early form of hatred that is very dominant in narcissistic personalities. But it is part of our potential for negative feelings that all of us have. Envy is a universal early form of aggressive negative feelings that gradually shifts from envy into feelings of jealousy that characterize later childhood, when the child has to compete for love with siblings and for the love of one of the parents with the other one of his parents. Jealousy is an essential emotion of triangular situation, of the Oedipal situation in psychoanalytic terminology. Envy is an essential negative emotion from very early levels of development, particularly related to negative experiences in the small child, in the baby's relation to mother. Frustrating experiences with mother would evoke resentment that would take the form of envy, what mother has to give and doesn't give and withholds. Envy is a very destructive feeling because envy tends to spoil and destroy what we need because we don't have it. So it is a self-defeating emotion that is dominant in narcissistic personalities' deep unconscious life. And the pathological grandiose self compensates them against the underlying envy, makes them feel they are great, they have everything, they don't need anything else, they don't need anybody else except admiration, and this permits them to live. What I've said completes what I wanted to tell you about symptoms, differential diagnosis, prognosis, degree of severity, and personality organization of these patients. We will now stop for 15 minutes, and then I will talk about what happens in the treatment of these patients, what kind of development happen in the treatment, what is treatable, what not, what are the complications, where are we now in our knowledge. I will now talk about the treatment of the narcissistic personality disorder. In general, the patients who are functioning the best possible way do not come for treatment. And they come for treatment only if they have some other symptom that bothers them. And for the reasons that I will mention, you will see that these very well-functioning patients are very difficult to treat. But even the very well-functioning narcissistic personalities tend to decompensate later in their life as external manifestations that make them attractive and that they used for admiration disappear. And in their 50s and 60s, when they retire from work and they have illnesses and they lose the attractiveness of their beauty and youth and health and social success, depressions may develop that bring them to treatment. Those at the intermediate level of severity usually have an indication for psychoanalytic treatment, for standard psychoanalysis. And those who function at the lower third have an indication for psychoanalytic psychotherapy, specifically the transference-focused psychotherapy that we have developed in our institute and that constitute a contemporary application of psychoanalytic knowledge to the specific need for the treatment of severe personality disorders. The prognosis for individual patients depends above all on two features. The prognosis is very good if there are no antisocial tendencies, and it becomes worse the more severe the antisocial tendencies. The antisocial personality disorder proper, the most severe form of narcissistic personality with antisocial behavior, has prognosis 0. But other than that, if patients with antisocial behavior and narcissistic personality may be treated, although their prognosis is less good than those patients who do not show such behavior. A second prognostic feature is what is called secondary gain of illness. Secondary gains refers to some advantage that the patient is obtaining from the illness and of his symptoms. For example, patients with narcissistic personality may develop depression because of failure, anxiety because of fear of social situations in which they may not functioning well and are afraid of being humiliated. And they may use such depression and anxiety to justify not working and depending on wealthy families, or depending on the state, or on various community agencies to provide them with support for living. That constitutes secondary gain of illness. And it is a dangerous development because it interferes with the treatment and with improvement. So that it's a prognostically negative factor if patients come to see us who already have learned to depend on families, to be inactive, to have a parasitic existence depending on the states, on welfare agencies, or on families. And it becomes very important to eliminate that secondary gain of illness by demanding from patients that they work, that they take active responsibility for their own life during the treatment. If that can be achieved, the prognosis gets definitely better and it makes a big difference. If it cannot be achieved, it severely militates against the effectiveness of treatment. I'm now going to mention to you the typical developments in the treatment of these patients, be it psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic psychotherapy. I'll discuss that jointly. What is common to psychoanalytic treatment and to the specific psychoanalytic psychotherapy for these patients is that the central task of the treatment is the analysis of the transference. What we call the transference is the repetition in the treatment situation of the most important past pathogenic relationships, those causes, those profound, serious and severe conflicts that determined the establishment of the pathological grandiose self in the first place, those conflicts around primitive aggression and envy that determined the establishment of the pathological grandiose self in the first place. In all cases, psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic psychotherapy work through an analysis of the unconscious repetition in the here and now of the significant conflicts of the past. That repetition in the here and now is called the transference. And the analysis of the transference is the essential instrument of the treatment. The techniques of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic psychotherapy are transference analysis by means of interpretation of the unconscious conflicts that show in the transference development, carried out by a psychoanalyst or a psychotherapist who operates from a position of technical neutrality, which means from a position outside the internal conflict of the patient, a concerned objectivity with which he helps the patient to understand the conflicts that are now becoming activated, using the information that comes from the patient's free association, that is to say, the patient's talking freely about whatever comes to his mind being in the session, and all patients are instructed to talk freely about whatever comes to their mind during the session. The therapist listens to what the patient is saying, but also observes their behavior in the session. And the therapist is alert to his own emotional reactions to the patient during the session, so that the information from what the patient says, the non-verbal behavior of the patient, and the emotional responses that occur inside the therapist, what is called the countertransference, determine the methods of treatment. The treatment, in essence, depends on the following technical interventions: interpretation of what is going on in the transference, interpretation, transference analysis, technical neutrality, that outside position of the therapist, and utilization of his countertransference reactions are the essential methods of treatment in psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic psychotherapy. Most patients with severe personality disorders who enter these treatments develop intense dependency on the therapist or the analyst, intense emotional reactions, intense regressions to the conflicts of the unconscious past that permit the treatment to carry out the functions that I mentioned. But in the case of narcissistic personality disorders, the opposite happens. These patients, in contrast to all other patients, do not develop a dependent relation to the therapist or the analyst. They seem not to develop any transference and maintain what looks on the surface as a perfectly, quote, normal, distant, uninvolved attitude in the treatment situation.
Per quanto riguarda la maggior parte dei pazienti con disturbi gravi della personalità, nella relazione terapeutica questi sviluppano un'intensa dipendenza dal terapeuta, delle reazioni emozionali molto forti e una regressione che porta all'esagerazione dei conflitti passati del paziente. Ma nel caso di disturbo di personalità narcisistica succede l'opposto. questi sembrano non sviluppare una dipendenza dal terapeuta e mantengono una posizione di distanza e di non coinvolgimento rispetto alla situazione terapeutica e sembrano non sviluppare nessun tipo di transfert.
What happens is that these patients feel that any dependency on the therapist threatens their grandiosity and their superiority and puts them into a position of inferiority, and they try to maintain their superiority in competition with the therapist and tend to develop subtle or not so subtle ways to depreciate or be contemptuous and show their superiority to the therapist. So what happens is that a very special transference develops in which they maintain a pseudo-independence, which is really an attitude of superiority over the analyst whom they put down in their experience and whom they try to control. And the therapist may feel that he's exposed to the ironic, contemptuous, superior, and even arrogant behavior of the patient, although that may be very subtle at first. These patients try to use the treatment as a kind of cognitive learnings. They want to hear what the therapist has to say, so they appropriate themselves of what they hear and become their own analysts. They extract knowledge from the therapist so that they don't need the therapist anymore, they think, and then can continue their own treatment. So it is as if they used the treatment to learn methods of treatment of the therapist and apply them to themselves, trying to maintain their independence and superiority. This relationship tends to get threatened whenever the therapist points out to them something that they have not been aware of. They feel any new knowledge that the therapist is giving them as a put down, as if now they are being treated as inferior being. Any new knowledge is like an insight, so that the treatment for them varies between their habitual superiority and moments where they feel inferior, humiliated, depreciated, and of course then try to reverse that situation. In short, there is a very special transference developing between one person who is superior and other person who is inferior. The patient's usual superiority gets reverted to his feeling inferior and seeing the therapist as grandiose and omnipotent. So there is an alternating, oscillating interchange of the superiority-inferiority role. At the bottom, it is as if the patient were enacting his pathological grandiose self while he is projecting the depreciated, devalued part of his self onto the therapist. And this relationship is reversed at times in which the pathological grandiose self is projected onto the therapist while the patient feels reduced to his inferior, usually rejected, denied traumatized self. And as this relationship gets analyzed by the therapist who analyzes the developments of this transference relationship, what happens gradually is that the relationship becomes more specific in the sense that the component identification is included in the pathological grandiose self. All the specific behaviors of those the patient imitated and identified with to achieve his grandiosity become reactivated and can be analyzed in their historical origins, so that gradually the pathological grandiose self gets dismantled, decomposed into its component identifications. In this process, gradually the intense negative affects, particularly intense envy, comes to the surface in the form of conscious and unconscious envy of the therapist. And the patient has to experience this painful envy as well as his efforts to defend against it. This shows, for example, in the so-called negative therapeutic reaction. That is to say, in the patient's complaining that nothing is helping, he's not getting anything from this treatment, the treatment is useless, he is wasting his time. And then there comes a session where the therapist is able to help the patient in a very intense and acute way. And as a result of experiencing help, the patient gets worse out of the unconscious envy of the therapist's capacity to help him. So the patient gets worse when he feels helped as an activation of unconscious envy, which then permits the analysis of this reaction and the general analysis of what happens to the patient in his life, who, when he finds something beautiful, attractive, valuable, he has to destroy it out of envy, which is what happens in his love relations, in relations with significant others, with important things that happen in his work. So that the working through of envy in the transference has important effects on the functioning of the patient in his entire life. During this process, it is unavoidable that the patient now experiences serious depressions on the one hand, and a sense of being attacked and depreciated by the therapist on the other. In other words, the narcissistic transference of grandiosity, distance, and superiority gets transformed into paranoid transferences out of the feeling of being attacked, depreciated, and mistreated, and finally into so-called depressive transferences when the patient comes to understand how he has engineered by his own derogatory, grandiose, and depreciative behaviors, destroying relationships, destroying the opportunities to learn, and profound regret for lost opportunities, and lost opportunities bring about depressive reactions in the transference. So typically, the transference shifts throughout time from narcissistic into paranoid, and then from paranoid into a depressive form of transference development. This situation is typical for what has been called the thick-skinned narcissist, the better functioning narcissistic personalities, for whom this kind of situations may be pretty typical, and very often in the early stages of the treatment, the protection against the development of any specific relationship with the therapist is so powerful that one is limited to analyze this kind of development in the relationship between the patient and other people. So the treatment starts out with careful analysis of relationships outside the treatment situation as the first step to then analyze the relationship in the treatment itself. This is typical for the so-called thick-skinned narcissistic personalities. But the more severe narcissistic personalities may come into treatment already with a certain frailty of the pathological grandiose self, with a breaking through of the underlying chaos of identity diffusion, with severe depression and anxiety and suicidal tendencies. These are the so-called thin-skinned narcissists that are characterized by violent shifts between grandiosity and superiority on the one hand, and terrible feelings of inferiority, depression, and even suicidal tendencies on the other, where the treatment is chaotic and oscillates between depreciation and rejection of the therapist on the one hand, and times of desperate need for the therapist and which wishes to be supported and helped by the therapist on the other. There is another type of narcissistic patients in whom the underlying aggressive tendencies infiltrate the pathological grandiose self, and whose grandiosity and superiority take aggressive forms, and these are called the syndrome of arrogance. These are patients who are extremely arrogant and who have a destructive form of depreciation and attack of others, including the therapist. And they show a typical strange development. Their behavior with the therapist is extremely arrogant and derogatory. At the same time, they act as if they could not listen to any reasoning, as if they were stupid, because they would not seem to understand anything that the therapist is saying. It is a pseudo-stupidity that one may observe even in highly intelligent people. And thirdly, they show an extraordinary curiosity about the life of the therapist, wanting to know everything that they can know about the personality, the privacy, the social life of the therapist. So they have a combination of arrogance, pseudo-stupidity, and curiosity, which at first seems terribly destructive of the treatment. The underlying dynamic is a fear over the pleasure of their own aggression that preserves their sense of superiority. So the fear of acknowledging the pleasure of their sadistic behavior is what motivates the pseudo-stupidity, so they cannot learn what is really going on in them. The acting of the arrogance and the curiosity in order to control the therapist and prevent the therapist from attacking them, which they fear because of the projection onto the therapist of their own aggression. The therapist's understanding of this dynamic permits the therapist to resist that aggression and gradually demonstrate to the patient the fear over the pleasure with his own aggression that then helps to gradually normalize this situation. And now I'm coming to the most severe types of narcissistic patients, those who function at the lowest level and who show what André Green, a French psychoanalyst, has called the narcissism of death or negative narcissism. These are patients who feel that their own superiority can only be maintained by the total destruction of all their relationships with everybody else, by a complete disappearance of their world, including a dismantling of their own personality. So these are patients who, although they are not suicidal in an acute sense, over a period of time destroy all their psychological life to achieve a state of nirvana, of psychological non-existence. There are two forms of these most severe cases. One, which is called the syndrome of the dead mother. The syndrome of the dead mother is usually developed in narcissistic personalities who had a mother who was severely depressed over extended periods of time during their infancy and childhood, conveying the impression that mother was not interested at all in her child. So there was an experience of not being loved, of being rejected, as if mother were dead and yet dead while being alive. And these patients then develop an unconscious sense that the only way to be loved is if they in turn were dead and therefore could accompany that dead mother, becoming a dead mother in the process, becoming united with her by identifying with her and feeling that in their own death they would refine that dead mother. So there is a tendency to dismantle all representations of all others and their own representation. And that is a silent process that ends up with their feeling no interest in anything in life. They can behave very correctly on the surface, They don't have the usual grandiosity of the narcissistic personalities. They may be very nice persons on the surface. They may not have any problem with morality. They may be perfectly adjusted externally, but with an internal sense of total emptiness, lack of interest, lack of gratification that makes life intolerable. And they may go through treatment over years without developing a relationship, and treatment may fail if that happens and drive them eventually to suicide. Under optimal circumstances, if one can revive in the treatment the underlying deepest frustrations of their need for love, whatever remains of the capacity of some kind of relationship, then one can build upon that. But it is uncertain to what extent this may happen in individual cases. And the last of these syndromes, perhaps the most severe, are patients whose grandiosity takes the form of trying to achieve control over life and death, over suffering, by harming themselves, by severely cutting themselves, destroying their body, cutting tendons, poisoning their body, losing part of fingers or an eye, severely destructive, physically self-harming behavior that occurs without depression, in a quiet, almost happy mode, with a sense of triumph, because they are not afraid of pain, they are not afraid of death, while everybody else who tries to take care of them is horrified and doesn't know how to help them. They have a sense of superiority over all the psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, and so from time to time they severely cut their arms, their legs, their body. They may eat rat poison. They may try to bleed themselves almost to death, very often hiding what they do to destroy themselves, so that physicians don't know what kind of illness is that. And these are patients who may do this out of the open air, in the middle of situations where they seem to be happily united with family members or on an outing. So it is episodic behavior, but it is behavior that destroys them gradually in ways that are frightening and defeating to their environment. As one example, one of our patients cut herself in the form of crisscrossing on her arm again and again and again, so that the arm got transformed into an informal mass of flesh. And all of this while the patient smiled friendly toward those who were trying to help her. That patient told her father at one point that because she felt suicidal, she was going to an emergency service so they could help her. The father was happy that she now recognized that this was an illness and was looking for help. So she went to the emergency service, but with razor blades, so that after having registered and waiting for attention, she cut herself severely as if to demonstrate the impotence of the emergency service to protect her from suicidal behavior. Another patient put her bed on fire while she lay down on it and caused a fire of the entire building. So these are the most severe cases, the large majority of whom, unfortunately, in the long run, cannot be saved. A few of them can be treated. This is perhaps the most severe manifestation of negative narcissism. It is severe self-destructiveness without depression, which is the hallmark of that syndrome. This completes my overview of this pathology. I repeat, most cases can be treated and helped, but there are some of the most severe forms of negative narcissism that we can diagnose but are not yet able to help in the present state of our knowledge. In the two last cases that I mentioned, the grandiosity consists in maintaining a complete independence from any external sources of suffering, limitation, inferiority, any negative influence of a world that is considered as a source of humiliation, pain, and failure. So the narcissism consists in an abandonment of all existential experience in a sense of total freedom in an eternal, quiet, stable state. That has a narcissistic, there is where the grandiosity lies at the bottom. And of course, the proof of this, in the case of the dead mother, is that in those cases where there is still some capacity for involvement that one discovers, it is connected with terrible suffering, a sense of abandonment, of lack of love, of loneliness, and need of others, of human needs, and that is denied in the total, the word that Andre Green uses, de-objectalization. It's the de-objectalization and the de-subjectivization and the desertification, the transformation of existence in a desert, that is the final solution of total freedom from any negative influence, and is a form of narcissism that no longer implies triumphing over others, but triumphing over the very existence of life through self-destruction. Andre Green, who described this syndrome, also observed that Freud used the concept of narcissism over many years to describe normal and abnormal narcissism. but stopped using the word narcissism after his proposal of the concepts of life and death drive. And Andre Green concluded that Freud's concept of the death drive replaced narcissism by what constituted, in fact, the negative narcissism represented by the death drive. So he proposed that Freud, in fact, had continued working on narcissism under the heading of the death drive, referring to negative narcissism. I think this is a very original and interesting recent contribution to the psychoanalytic understanding of narcissism. If I may add something instead of another question, if there's time for that, there is one more clinical form of very severe narcissistic pathology that I did not have time to mention, which is intermediate between pathological narcissism that attempts superiority over the world and the negative narcissism which achieves superiority by self-destruction. There is an intermediate form which is the intolerance of triangulation. It is a special syndrome which we discover in the treatment of very severely ill patients, in which there is an intolerance of any different view that the therapist has of the patient. The therapist or the analyst has to totally agree with the patient, because if he disagrees, it is as if the patient were threatened with an invasion by a foreign force or by total abandonment. It is as if the patient were trying to recreate an original symbiotic relationship with mother, in which there is a total fusion with mother and no other reality, and in that fusion the patient has, together with the fused mother, total control over the world. So that these patients develop immediate, severe rage attacks or severe affective crisis as soon as they find the slightest difference of the therapist's view. And for a long period of time, the only thing that the therapist can do is precisely point out to the patient that they suffer from an intolerance of any view, of any third person, so to speak, other than their symbiotic relation with the therapist who agrees with them. No outsider is permitted to maintain an illusion of such a union, and this has to be explained and reiterated again and again until the reasons for that fear of an external world can be ventilated and talked about, so that this is another clinical form of very severe narcissistic pathology, intermediate between the higher level ones and the two most severe ones that I mentioned. That completes the whole complex.
Va bene, io volevo ringraziare tutti i partecipanti, gli allievi, i soci, gli ospiti che sono intervenuti qui a questo seminario. Devo ricordare che l'IPP organizza un sabato al mese più o meno, questo era il primo di questo nuovo anno 2012-2013, per cui se volete avere delle informazioni potete andare sul nostro sito www.ippweb.it per avere informazioni sui nostri seminari ulteriori. Ringrazio calorosamente il dottor Kernberg, ringrazio Andrea Scalabrini per essersi prodigato di questa grande fatica e ci salutiamo. Grazie mille.